The topic is on institutionalization and impact assessment of South-South and triangular cooperation. We're going to share key findings and recommendations from Southern think tanks. The designation of this day, United Nations Day for South-South Cooperation on September 12th, shows the commitment of the United Nations to support cooperation among developing countries. This has been proven a very important way to advance human development for decades. It is a pillar in support of achievement of sustainable development goals, and proven especially true and more needed more than ever today at the time of crisis we are facing, compound crisis with not only the public health pandemic, but also poverty, climate change, and conflicts and crises. The impact of South-South cooperation has been widely recognized, yet evidence-based research still needs to keep pace with the progress of South-South cooperation, with this modality enlarging its scope, scale, and volume, and deepen its impact on sustainable development. At this event, we aim to presenting innovative research on South-South cooperation, institutionalization, and impact assessment. We're going to share knowledge in order to support, deepen, and better understanding of this development cooperation in order to better support it to achieve larger impact and long-lasting sustainable impact for human development. We have several South-South idea papers surrounding this topic, and today we're going to share with you in detail 3 of them. They are developed under the South-South Global Thinkers Initiative, which we proudly jointly support with UNDP, UNOSSC. This Global Thinkers Initiative involves over 200 think tanks from the Global South with participation with institutions from the North as well. They have been playing a very important role in bringing forward the knowledge and in advancing thought leadership from developing countries. So without ado, I have the pleasure to welcome Mr. Haoliang Xu, UN Assistant Secretary General, UNDP Assistant Administrator and Director of Bureau for Policy and Program Support, to provide us opening remarks. Mr. Xu, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Grace, for inviting UNDP to co-organize this important event, and distinguished panelists, and members of the representatives of the South-South Global Thinkers think tank community, and dear participants from around the world. So thank you for joining this event, and a happy UN South-South Cooperation Day. It's a great pleasure for me to welcome you all to this celebration on behalf of the UNDP, and I thank you all for joining us today in this event jointly organized by UNDP and the UN Office for South-South Cooperation. More than a decade ago, the General Assembly adopted a resolution to commemorate the International South-South Cooperation Day yearly. This is an opportunity to reflect on the invaluable role of South-South and triangular cooperation to support the achievements of the Sustainable Development Goals. The spirit of global solidarity evidenced by the South-South and triangular cooperation is now more important than ever, not only in responding to COVID-19, but also in building forward better. Today is a great opportunity not only to reaffirm our commitment to South-South and triangular cooperation, but also to highlight the key contributions of Southern as well as Northern think tanks to this important endeavor. As highlighted by the outcome document of the second high-level conference on South-South cooperation in 2019, it is crucial to strengthen think tanks and knowledge networks as institutional spaces for knowledge development and sharing on South-South and triangular initiatives. The same document requests UN entities to support them in this endeavor. Similarly, the 20th session of the High-Level Committee on South-South Cooperation, held in June this year, recognized the key role of Southern think tanks and the related actors. Since 2017, UNDP and the UN Office for South-South Cooperation have been proud to host the South-South Global Think Tanks Initiative, a global coalition of think tank networks for South-South cooperation. The initiative supports the production of frontier research on South-South and triangular cooperation, contributing to a growing body of evidence and knowledge on issues pertinent to South-South and triangular cooperation, and to inform policy dialogues and advance thought leadership. I'm pleased to note that to date, more than 200 think tanks have pooled their research and knowledge to inform policy dialogue and agenda setting on South-South cooperation and triangular cooperation globally. Today, we're pleased to launch and present the findings of commissioned research papers, South-South Ideas, developed by members of the South-South Global Thinkers, grouped under two very important aspects of South-South and triangular cooperation, that is, its institutionalization and its impact assessment. These research papers come in very timely, as many member states are challenged by the gap of institutional capacities and the tools in managing, coordinating, and monitoring the flux of more multidimensional and multi-actor South-South and triangular cooperation. The papers presented today are well positioned to address these needs and gaps. I hope you all are inspired by the research and can seize the opportunity to exchange views and perspectives on the challenges, experience, and opportunities of these two topics. Our hope is to see this event as an opportunity to bring forth the vision expressed in the outcome document and the high-level conference decisions. UNDP is fully committed to this vision, and in fact, the recently approved UNDP Strategic Plan 2022 and 2025 recognized that South-South and triangular cooperation as integral to how UNDP works and thinks about the future of development. We look forward to continuing our collaboration with UN Office for South-South Cooperation. I wish you all a successful event, and thank you very much for your kind attention. Over to you, Grace.
Thank you very much, Ha-Liang, for this important recognition of this initiative and opening remarks for this event. It is indeed a pleasure to work with your team jointly to support this initiative and to advance the research. Colleagues, today, we are jointly launching the 3 South-South idea papers, along with 2 additional ones that will be launched after this event via social media. The papers we will launch today focus on the following. Maybe we can also start to show the PowerPoint of methodological plurality and impact assessment of South-South cooperation, a synthesis from efficiency perspective authored by the Network of Southern Think Tank Network, NEST. This paper attempts to develop a set of methodological tools and indicators to assess the efficiency of South-South cooperation from the perspective of its distributive implications and its role in ensuring agency efficiency in terms of reduction in transaction costs of delivery of developmental inputs to partner countries in need. In doing so, it is centered on the fundamental recognition of plurality as the source of strength of South-South cooperation. So this one will be presented and discussed in detail during our meeting. And the next one is institutional frameworks for South-South cooperation in Latin America, lessons from Argentina, Brazil, and Mexico. This is offered by NEST also, but it's Latin America chapter. The South-South idea paper aims to provide updated understanding of South-South cooperation practices, policies in Latin America region, and demonstrated by 3 case studies, Argentina, Brazil, and Mexico. The paper is to help us better understand whether national South-South institutions in the 3 countries can provide us lessons learned in following stronger dialogue and coordination at the regional level, and if so, to what extent. And the next paper we're going to discuss in detail today is designing a survey of the institutional architecture of South-South cooperation, a feasibility study. So this is authored by the ODI, Overseas Development Institute, a member of the GRISES think tank network. And this paper aims to assess the feasibility of a global survey of the institutional architecture of South-South and triangular cooperation. The aim of the survey is to better understand the governance structures, but also the regulatory regime and administrative features of South-South cooperation providers. With such a survey, it hopes to find findings and seeks to establish a set of baseline data that can be reviewed and published annually. So we can see that from all the 3 different papers, it looks at South-South cooperation impact and institutionalization, recognizing the unique characteristics of this cooperation modality. And rather than seeking to tightly put everything into framework, it looks at various approaches of different countries and the diversity of approaches. And then eventually to say that based on that, would we be able to build a database on top of collecting data from global surveys and other tools to advance the information base for South-South cooperation in order to inform our impact assessment and understanding of the trend. There are 2 more research papers. One we will discuss more through social media is to advancing alternative development paradigm, a case study of the Indian Technical and Economic Cooperation Program. This is developed by Public Affairs Center, a member of the Southern Voice think tank network. And this one is a case study using a program already applying some dimensions to analyze the effectiveness of the program and similar programs under the principles of South-South. Another case study is about the role of institutional arrangement for South-South cooperation experiences from Ecuador and Sri Lanka. So this one will be has been authored by Southern Voice Secretariat, Grupi Faro in Ecuador, and the Institute of Policy Studies in Sri Lanka. This paper seeks to gain insights into the institutional arrangement within which South-South and North-South initiatives take place in these 2 countries. The paper is aimed to identify good practices and also experiences, lessons learned that can enable South-South cooperation partner countries to improve their management of both South-South and North-South cooperation. So this will also seek to find complementarities between different development cooperation providers. I know I have read into the video that you're going to show, Shams and Raphael. Maybe you can now show the whole video. Sorry if I interrupted the rhythm of the music. you. Yeah, so now we have deep impression of these three papers. Actually, we will have the pleasure today to dialogue with the main authors of the three papers. The first one I would now like to introduce is Professor Sachin Chaturvedi, Director General at the Research and Information System for Developing Countries, RIS, India. He works on issues related to development economics, involving development finance, SDGs, South-South cooperation, apart from trade, investment, and innovation linkages with special focus on WTO. Currently, he's also Vice Chairman of Madhya Pradesh State Policy and Planning Commission and Vice Chairman Atal Bihari Vajpayee Institute of Good Governance and Policy Analysis and member Board of Governors, Reserve Bank of India. He will present the finding of the first paper. And Professor Sachin, I know we have a lot of dialogues on this issue, and it's always been very loud and clear that you're emphasizing the plurality of South-South cooperation, recognizing plurality, diversity as the source of strength for this kind of cooperation. So what are the key components in this proposed methodological framework you presented in this paper that assess the impact of South-South cooperation, but fully recognizing the plurality and using it as a strength for this kind of modality? And what would be the implication for international organizations, partner countries, and local communities in applying this kind of open, broad framework? Professor Sachin, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Thanks a lot, Grace. And at the outset, must congratulate you and the UNOSSC for nurturing, creating the South-South ideas and bringing in all think tanks, research institutions in this. As you would recall, we have what is called as Delhi process. And in the Delhi process, the sixth meeting of which is due now, we are planning sometime as soon as this crisis is over, later in December. And our idea is to see how this measurement part goes in. And you very rightly said, we have been discussing about the plurality. We have been talking about the idea of bringing all different actors with their own modalities, with their own approach, and with their own philosophical frameworks, which are going to strengthen the idea of South-South cooperation. So as we heard Aling Shu, who said in terms of how the idea of policy dialogue, and he also emphasized in his initial remarks on SSC and on triangular cooperation, I think we have now a renewed context to go in. And I have just a small PowerPoint to share. At the outset, would also like to recognize my colleagues at NEST, Professor Milindo Chakravarti, Andre, Elizabeth, Professor Lee Xiaoyan, and all other our team members, Dr. Sushil Kumar and Denoj, my own office colleagues, to emphasize on the point in terms of how we look at the whole question of partnership, how the plurality, which has become fundamental strength of South-South cooperation, very well recognized in 1978, BAPA, and even after 40 years when we adopted BAPA plus 40, where again UNOSSC played an important role. We try to see internal institutional structures that exhibit this pluralism. So it is not just about semantics, it is about the way Southern institutions within the countries are structured. And that's where you find this paper capturing the fundamental recognition of this. And there are sort of 8 broad divisions within the paper, within the study, that have tried to capture extent of multi-layered plurality, the issues of effectiveness and efficiency of development cooperation, the historical trends that bring it in, the process of the whole engagement that brings in both the visible hands and the market-led processes that also bring in the issues related to efficiency. And we have tried to play around with that in one of the sections where visible and invisible land we have discussed, but also have tried to distinguish the OECD-led analytical lens and the developing country-led development cooperation, and how in the TRC we can really bring the assessment templates closer to the idea of South-South cooperation. If you look at effectiveness and into efficiency of South-South cooperation in cost-effective manner, countries have taken up their own stand, and you would see this plurality is evident across countries, as I would just in a minute show, as to how this wide division and bandwidth that we see. But we propose to see this template coming out, and the NEST is trying to bring in greater consensus. In the last meeting, or the 5th meeting of Delhi process, we evolved the framework, and our idea is that some case studies would be done using these templates. And these templates on South-South cooperation, they bring in distinct components designed to assess adherence, as I said, to the principles of South-South cooperation, assessment of the performance, assess the impact of SSC and social capital. And what we did in identifying the adherence of principles of South-South cooperation, we say that they are again nation-specific. Some nations specify on some dimensions of South-South cooperation more than the others. Like, for instance, in case of India, we emphasize on trade and investment. In case of Brazil, they don't. China and India that way are far closer to each other of bringing in trade and investment as part of South-South cooperation. We find that countries in Latin America do not connect much with trade and investment, but both have great adherence in terms of the social capital that South-South cooperation brings in. So plurality and divergence and convergence within South-South are also dealt with in our paper. And we have said that this is largely a country-led process. And the country-led process allows the freedom for countries to choose their areas of intervention, and also bring in the bandwidth that they need to be accountable, and accountable in the sense, not the one that we talk at the DAC platform, but more in terms of their own account keeping and book keeping. But it should augment the spirit of solidarity, trust, and sharing, enhance mutual benefit, and identify a roadmap to further contribute to allocative and technical efficiency for all. This was the table that I had in mind when I was discussing in terms of how specific countries emphasize. And you would find that most of the countries from the South have emphasized largely on similar sort of grounds. And I picked up Ibero-America because this table gives a huge summary they have drawn out from almost all of the Latin American region. And here, quite a few dimensions you would find are converging and bringing in countries at par with each other. I don't have to get into details of this, but this table, and as the paper describes, they are largely converging and have several commonalities. But as I said, on specific modalities, the distinctions come in, particularly on trade investment, even on technology. So that those dimensions are slightly different. Fortunately, my UNOSSC has played an important role in terms of documenting this. So quite a few of these details are already captured. When we say mutual benefit, when we say national ownership or demand-driven, the connotations vary, and as a result, statistical measures to capture them, they also differ. So when you talk of mutual benefit, for instance, creating market access for partners, enhancing knowledge, human capital, and production bases, or even inclusion in the value chain, which is becoming a new reality for the South, where more and more countries are keen to become part of value chain. So you distinguish the mutual benefit from various components. And that, I think, is the new reality. And South-South cooperation post-COVID would have to get these new realities absorbed, and the measurement techniques should reflect this new reality. Nature of demand, even the principal one, nature of demand and nature of response to demand. These are two different ways that you can capture statistical nuancing of it. And that would connect with the way you connect with value chain in the first point. Compatibility with national development strategy, deliberately I am coming after demand driven because that's where creation of local capacities would come in. So under several mega infrastructure projects, we need to see the capacities that are coming in, and we need to identify the national development strategies as part of the wider connect post-COVID, and also as we enter in the final decade for sustainable development goals. So South-South cooperation would have to play an important role in this, and that I think should also be part of the assessment framework. Non-conditionality and horizontally are pretty simple and straight, so I'm not getting into it. The idea of capacity building, educational cooperation, human resources and development, academic cooperation. The first itself shows remarkable plurality and remarkable ability to capture different dimensions. At G15, we have seen some of these discussions in WTO, but at the wider G20 level, when it comes to debt forgiveness or restructuring DSSI, we are trying to see how these dimensions are contributing. India and China and South Africa and Brazil are very much there in terms of taking it forward on trade. As I said, exceptions come in, and the debt relief also different sequencing in terms of how we calculate and how we bring in the measurement techniques here. So this largely reflects the ideas that I had in mind in terms of capturing the details of the paper. And that plurality, as Grace asked, has practical relevance for countries. And once we have the case studies done, Grace, I tell you how important it would be for national governments, apart from the international agencies, national governments, to be sort of responsive to people's concerns in terms of impact assessment and evaluation. So what we are trying to do at this point is to identify Southern principle sensitive methodologies. The ABC of Brazil has already come up with some of the cases, and I'm sure Laura would capture it further as they did in case of Cotton 4, remarkable work in terms of assessment. But when the data reporting comes from national governments, the structure that we need probably would hover around the framework that we have just presented to you. And the details of this are very much in the paper. So I would stop here. Thanks for giving the opportunity.
Thank you very much, Professor Sachin, for introducing the key elements of this research paper, and also inspired me of thinking that what are the concrete steps following the sharing of all these papers. We did have some initial plans, and we will further dialogue with the steering committee of the Global Thinkers to engage the policymakers and the development cooperation managers in the countries to basically come together to together dialogue with us what would be the implications and how could we take those research findings into some of their daily practices. But thank you very much for this presentation. And as you mentioned, that the next one immediately follows this, looks into the institutional arrangement in 3 countries in Latin America. And I would like to introduce to everybody, Ms. Laura Lopez, co-founder of Articulação Research and Policy Center in Brazil. Ms. Lopez has more than 17 years of experience as a South-South expert, both as a researcher and a practitioner. She has worked in the Brazilian Cooperation Agency of the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, Itamaraty, and in different NGOs and international organizations, including UN agencies and funds. So Laura will present the finding of the institutional frameworks for South-South cooperation in Latin America, lessons from Argentina, Brazil, Mexico. And we know that these are all very well-established South-South partners and will definitely provide to us very rich learning. The research look at the lessons learned, but I have two questions for Laura as well. One is, what are the similarities and differences of the institutional frameworks comparing the three case study countries that you have studied in Latin America? What are the main recommendations for policymakers in this context? Yeah, thank you, Laura. The floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Grace. Thank you all. I thank UNOSSC for the support of this research assignment and the kind team of UNOSSC as well. And also my colleagues from Nest Latam. I'm representing them today. I thank their trust. Nest Latam is the regional chapter of the network of Southern think tanks, Nest. And this was actually our first assignment as a regional chapter. So I really appreciate UNOSSC's support to strengthen the chapter in this regard. As you said, the three countries have strong histories and very different institutional arrangements, and they all work in their own way. So we have some maybe surprising findings that I'm gonna try to present to you. I would also very quickly like to share the unfortunate information that I was just tested positive for COVID yesterday. So I'm not feeling 100%. I don't have any serious symptoms, but I will try my best to stay to the end of the panel. But if not, I have some other colleagues from Nest Latam that maybe they can also participate. I'm sorry to bring this sad news here, but I think it's also illustrative of the moment, and it can give the event some contemporary flair or something.
Sorry to hear that, Laura, but we do wish it will be, be mild and you will be able to recover very soon.
Yes, thank you. I'm luckily fully vaccinated, which is also something that it's important. But anyway, I mean, this assignment was really challenging in a way. I guess when we started, we were envisioning a series of meetings, of face-to-face meetings, and they are really important. I know that Zoom can, replace some of these processes, but when you have, we had a lot of researchers joining in from different countries, so it was really hard. I mean, we were lucky to have one face-to-face meeting, January 2019 in Rio. And after that, it was all online exchanges, and that was really challenging. So I would like to maybe put that as a side note. Nonetheless, we had some really interesting exchanges and lessons learned. Maybe if we can start on a more general note about the three countries. All three countries, they have been through kind of a wave of South-South cooperation enthusiasm and, euphoria in the early 2000s, in the first decade maybe. And then they started going through rougher times, South-South cooperation. So it was interesting to see that on the one hand, the three countries really vary. They had trouble adhering to the term South-South cooperation. And this is something that we find in many countries, not just the three that we are talking about specifically here, but South-South cooperation, the term, can be seen as politically charged and very specifically connected to a leftist foreign policy in general terms, right, in the three countries. So what we found is that maybe the institutions that are in charge of South-South cooperation in the three countries, they chose different names throughout the recent period, such as, you know, contributions to international development, horizontal cooperation, which is the way Argentina sometimes call it. So this was interesting because it was a way, we found that it was a way of circumventing this politically charged term of South-South cooperation that is not rarely, not only associated to a specific kind of foreign policy orientation, but it's also said to be too emphatic on a North-South divide, which is not necessarily true, right? And I think that the role of triangular cooperation or trilateral cooperation is just to, is really to try to circumvent this exaggerated North-South divide of South-South cooperation. But what we saw was that it's still there, this uneasy with the term. But I think it's also interesting to note that, I mean, across the world, China has decisively adopted the term, right? It's the name of their fund, it's the name of their policy. They adopted the term in a very decisive way. So I guess it's something that it's not, I mean, the term is not to be forgotten, although it has been adapted and adjusted in Latin America and specifically in these 3 countries. So I'm going to try to summarize a little bit some of our findings and recommendations. As Professor Sachin said, in Latin America, we have a historic identification of South-South cooperation with technical cooperation. The first BAPA, the first Buenos Aires Plan of Action, was about technical cooperation among developing countries, TCDC. TCDC was the how do you say, the sigla, I don't know, the letters that identified South-South cooperation within the Brazilian Cooperation Agency. The Brazilian Cooperation Agency itself, it's exclusively dedicated to technical cooperation. So it plays a strong role in the region, right? It varies. I mean, Mexico has a more diverse in the same institution, but in general, technical cooperation plays a very strong role in the region. And that is something that is also has the merit of circumventing the political chargedness of South-South cooperation, right? So, and I think it also has the merit of, I mean, it makes it easier to assess and to build institutions and instruments, because technical cooperation is something that is more measurable. And also, on the other hand, there is this, I guess when we're talking, I mean, if on the one hand, it's difficult to find a homogeneity on the terms, on the conceptual framework for South-South cooperation. South-South cooperation has a very loose conceptual framework. It means different things for different people and in different countries. And I find it very interesting that the official UN definition is so all-encompassing. I think it shows how hard it is to really pin South-South cooperation and put it in a box. And I also think that it's easier, South-South cooperation, it's easier to, it becomes more visible when you look at the principles and when you look at it against, I mean, in contrast to something, right? Against a background, like a jellyfish or something. It becomes more visible when you put it against what it's not, right? And it's not, I mean, it may be a lot of things, but it's not ODA, right? This is, I mean, the minimum that we can say about South-South cooperation. We can build from there. But I guess the principles they are, I think I think it's really important that I'm sorry, I'm getting a bit confused here. Going back, I think that the principles of mutual benefits and horizontality, they become very visible in technical cooperation. So that may be a specific contribution from Latin America and from these three countries that have developed their own experiences on the subject. Mexico has a more robust and, you know, written down, and the other, and Brazil, it's maybe in the middle, and Argentina has a very loose way. But what we found is that it doesn't really matter in this loose framework, in this, I mean, Brazil doesn't even have a legal framework for being a donor, but it has worked like that for 30 years, right? So it's not necessarily, there's not necessarily a direct relation between a robust, you know, legal framework and institutional framework and effectiveness. It's hard to say because we don't have a lot of evaluation, but I mean, we should maybe be more open-minded to these different and looser institutional frameworks that have been around for South-South cooperation for so long, right? And I think they speak a lot about the reality of these countries, about the history of South-South cooperation in these countries, the idea that most of these institutions were receivers of technical cooperation, and now they are this hybrid, they do both things, you know. In the case of Brazil, the majority is South-South cooperation, but ABC is also manages received technical cooperation. And it's not just, I mean, a technicality. I think it speaks a lot about it. So, I mean, the paper goes into the details of this research that we did on the history, on the conceptual frameworks, institutional frameworks. But also we did a little outreach with international organizations and some key stakeholders. And one of the recommendations that we came up with was that although there are some international organizations in the region that are playing a very important role connecting the countries and kind of fostering dialogue, there's still room for a more active role for regional organizations. I mean, they're still kind of shy approaching South-South cooperation, and maybe even this, the name thing has something to do with it. And I'm thinking about ECLAC specifically. But I mean, we must recognize the role played by the Ibero-American organization and the program for strengthening South-South cooperation and the reports that they publish every now and then. And it's really important and it's really good, but also it's hard to come to terms with the fact that it's an, I don't know, a Madrid-based, and that the Ibero-American organization has this undeniable kind of colonial, I don't know, background to it, right? It's debatable whether the Ibero-American organization is the best positioned organization to deal with South-South cooperation in the region. So, I mean, just wrapping up, I know my time may be coming to an end. What we also, one of our recommendations or findings actually was that, the finding was that it's not really clear why, maybe because of this adaptability and of this looser institutional framework or adaptable institutional frameworks, but the fact is that South-South cooperation has survived in the three countries, in not only in the great golden age of South-South cooperation, but also in the contemporary less than favorable political environment. And that, I think, speaks a lot about the technical networks that were formed, and because they were relevant and because they were pertinent, and they became, and they are resilient to this kind of political swings. So I guess this is maybe the key takeaway for this assignment, is that this technical nature of South-South cooperation in Latin America may be key to its survival across different political orientations. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Lara. I'm sure you know your symptom is very mild. You're very clear in presenting your all the findings of the team. Thank you very much. And Lara, I think you have made these points very clear, despite the different branding, different institutional arrangement, and maybe even conceptualization of South-South cooperation. It seems the feature of mutual benefit and horizontality are common among the partners that advancing this kind of development cooperation. And that is very clear from your evidence research. Secondly, the recommendation regarding more active role of regional organizations is also very timely. Now we know the regional integration and regional efforts are picking up the momentum again. And I think Latin America, in a way, that are also demonstrating some examples, for other regions as well. ECLAC, you mentioned, right? They have the South-South Committee, and that's the only institutional arrangement in the regional commission that has that. Now they are even expanding that into a South-South conference, as they recently announced at the high-level commission and at various occasions with our office, to bring in more dynamic development partnership. I guess this again echo back to your first finding of horizontality and mutual benefits of all partners. And that naturally leads to the third point that I'm reflecting on from your talk about the Northern partners. Triangular cooperation is now showing more active engagement and active role of Northern partners in expanding the cooperation and bringing diverse resources and expertise into the whole making. So South-South cooperation has evolved from the 50s to now 7 decades. And this era is, especially you mentioned the technical dimension. I think the development focus of South-South cooperation through technical exchanges, through economic cooperation, advancing sustainable development as a central goal seems to give us a better, platform to advance this modality. And that, thank you very much with all these insights. I now have the pleasure to introduce actually from ODI, the Dr. Nima Jani, sorry, Senior Research Fellow from ODI, United Kingdom. So she will present the finding of designing a survey of the institutional architecture globally, right, of South-South cooperation, whether that is feasible, what should we do with it? So for this one, my question is, so Nilima, what are the benefits and challenges of such a global survey? What will be the key success factors in promoting a global exercise of this scale that requires further refinement and resources? How would a global survey contribute then to the recommendation of advancing South-South cooperation? How would that contribute to the way that the United Nations system support South-South cooperation? So the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Grace, for that introduction. And I will endeavor to try and answer those 3 questions over the length of the presentation. But if I haven't by the end, please probe me further. I'm going to just try and get my presentation up. So just give me 1 second. Great. Okay. So first of all, I'm very pleased to be here, to be able to mark the International Day for South-South Cooperation with such an esteemed group of panelists and voices on the issue. As Grace mentioned, I'm a senior research fellow at the Overseas Development Institute, which I guess is sort of earmarked as a northern think tank, although I consider my identity somewhat a hybrid one. And I hope in that spirit can offer my feedback and comments on the state of South-South cooperation. I would like to very much thank the UN Office of South-South Cooperation and UNDP for supporting this research under the South-South Global Thinkers Initiative, as well as the network that ODI forms part of, the Global Research Consortium on Economic Structural Transformation, to which ODI belongs, as well as finally all those who contributed to this research, both as interviewees or questionnaire respondents. So with that, I will get started. And I would like to start by presenting two articles from the BAPA Plus 40 declaration. The first, Article 25, to improve data collection at the national level to promote cooperation in the development of methodologies and statistics. And the second, Article 27C, to assist developing countries upon request in building the human and institutional capacity needed to formulate and implement national development policy strategies and programs for South-South and triangular cooperation. These were two articles that were in the declaration, and I think this paper sits at the intersection of them. It is an attempt to try and unify the commitment to data collection as well as the commitment to build that institutional capacity through the potential launch of a survey which would collect data on the institutional structures of South-South cooperation in particular. And I guess, why would we do this? So I'd like to offer a few thoughts on why this might be helpful, not only to maintain the commitment to these two articles, but I think there's a recognition that South-South and triangular cooperation have expanded in scale and complexity. A 2017 UNOSSC survey suggested 74% of developing countries provide some form of development cooperation. And that complexity, both in terms of the number of states, but also the plurality of arrangements that both my fellow panelists have alluded to, suggests that there's an opportunity to collect more data to both inform the institutional design choices of countries in the South, but also to learn from what others have done. And I just want to emphasize, this is not a way of forcing a one-size-fits-all solution, but really an attempt to recognize the institutional diversity in the way South-South cooperation is organized, and really try and see within that diversity, are there some common design principles that we're seeing, as well as some common challenges. I think it can also help us understand the relationship between delivery choices and impact. And I think overall improve South-South cooperation's ability to deliver on its commitment to development effectiveness and the achievement of the Agenda 2030. It can also be useful in triangulating data on institutional structures of the South with other data points relating to impact and effectiveness, which are being gathered through other initiatives. And lastly, I think it can expand the horizons of South-South cooperation scholarship and policy. The initiative would obviously be anchored in data creation through Southern institutions and allow for engagement in Southern's own knowledge and data creation. There was some allusion to the role that Sigid plays by my previous panelists. And I think it is very important that this initiative sits very firmly in the context of a Southern-based institution. I think collecting data anchored in the South also demonstrate a certain amount of good faith among Southern cooperation providers, a commitment to some of the key principles of evidence and transparency, and can build trust to transcend that artificial binary divide between North and South, potentially. And I think lastly, if the South does not start to collect such data, I think we can see others doing it instead. And I think you see initiatives globally situated in other multilateral institutions and exclusively Northern-based think tanks. And I think it would be important for the South to assert leadership on this agenda. So what did we do? I'm unable to move to the next screen. Hello?
We can't hear you.
You can hear me? Okay, I'm unable for some reason to move. I can, Raphael, if you have control, you can. Otherwise, I will just carry on without the presentation. I can talk to it, not a problem. Here we go.
I'm requesting remote control.
Okay.
Please go ahead, and I will share it from my side. Just give me 1 minute.
Try it again. See if you can go.
Sorry, I will share it from my side.
Okay, perfect. Okay, so what did we do with this survey? So essentially, with this project, I should say. So we were trying to investigate the feasibility of doing a global survey, which would look at Southern providers' institutional organization and setup. So to start, we did a literature review, which was a non-probabilistic sampling. So it was not exhaustive, thank you, Raphael, not an exhaustive survey of all the publications that existed, but we were looking for both official sources, academic sources, policy sources, non-governmental sources, published since 2015, which offered a systematic comparative analysis anchored in an empirical understanding of the way Southern governments organize South-South cooperation. The publications could have been published in English, French, or Spanish, which are languages that I understand. So we understand it is limited and does not cover the full range of publications that exist. Nonetheless, we were able to survey about 20 publications of very substantial depth. In parallel to the literature review, we also sought to solicit opinions on a prospective survey amongst key stakeholders, both actors in organizations that have done research on this topic, as well as Southern policymakers themselves and civil servants working in South-South cooperation. We launched a light touch online questionnaire to obtain a non-random sample of Southern bilateral officials. And I will say we had a low response rate, which 11% response rate, despite multiple emails and reminder, which suggests a certain low level of engagement overall within the community. And maybe we could talk about what that results might mean later on if such a global survey were to be launched. So while we had both forms of data, I think it's fair to say that our conclusions rested probably more so on the literature review than it did on the online questionnaire. Okay, Raphael, you can move to the next slide, please. So I just want to quickly go through some of the main conclusions from the review in the first place. So what we saw is what you broadly characterize as, in this literature, a more selective approach to institutional analysis, more common than a systematic approach. So by selective, I mean largely drawing on a group of country experiences and largely focused on interpretive data. And from that analysis, there was an extrapolation of lessons, institutional pillars, and factors, for example, that could be drawn from those selective country experiences. We saw less evidence in the literature on measurable data relating to some of the core conceptual categories of institutional design and development. And by core categories, I mean categories that in some level can transcend some of the diversity and variation across South-South cooperation to develop a picture of its public administration overall. So here I draw on some of the literature in comparative public administration, which talk about some of the core conceptual categories, as for example, governance structures, the number of entities that exist in the domestic public administration, who coordinates those entities, the implementing bodies and the lines of authority that exist. Or for example, the regulatory structures, the laws, rules, and regulations around South-South cooperation. Or another category, the administrative structures, the HR systems, the budgetary data, the monitoring and evaluation systems, the public communication strategies and systems that exist. So these are core conceptual categories in comparative public administration, which we did not see anchored in our literature review. We saw, as I said, more selective approaches. And we think that both approaches have value. But I think the fact that we are skewed so heavily in this field on the selective approach suggests that some opportunity exists to build up a more systematic approach. We also saw that this comparative institutional analysis seems to be focused largely on the BRICS and specific regions, in particular Africa and Latin America. So much less analysis within the Asian region in particular. We see more data on governance and regulatory structures, sorry, it should be regulatory structures, than on administrative governance in particular. Raphael, you can move on to the next slide. We also saw it was more common to have in such comparative institutional analysis to report on voluntary activity level data rather than comprehensive data on some of these key institutional features that I alluded to earlier. And lastly, we saw that regional and multilateral institutions are the main sources of data on the institutional aspects of South-South cooperation. There were far fewer studies that came from individual governments of the South, and if they did, they were offered in partnership with the North, for example, an MXC GIZ study that we found. Next one, Raphael, please. So the main conclusions from our interviews and the questionnaire. So I think there was a perception, particularly coming out of the interviews and the online questionnaire, that Southern providers are under data gathered in this systematic fashion. Also a sense that there was an opportunity here for robust comparisons, that in some sense, by taking the data one level up and trying to develop some common conceptual categories, it might avoid getting lost in some of the details, which obviously offers richness, but also potential makes comparisons difficult. There was also a sense that there seemed to be a lot of focus on the BRICS and suggested there was more opportunity to learn from some of the smaller providers of South-South cooperation as well. Collecting such data might also even out access to information and knowledge about national systems internationally across domestic governments, by which I mean sometimes this information is concentrated in the executive as opposed to across line ministries. And so it might be a helpful way to even out that uneven access to information. And that actually collecting such data might unintentionally draw attention to particular challenges, which can then be subsequently improved. Raphael, next one, please. So on the online questionnaire, we did ask this question, why would it be valuable? So I think this gets to one of the questions that Grace asked me initially. And the top choice we received an answer to was it fosters knowledge sharing. And I think that sits very much in the ethos of mutual benefit and horizontality that are pillars of South-South cooperation, but also more practically helping to identify partners, stimulating innovation and learning, benchmarking and comparison. And the last two, operational effectiveness and transparency and communications. Next one, Raphael, please. So the main challenges. So quickly, I'll quickly try and address these, but I think there are three main challenges that were identified. The first is a political one. And in particular, there was some attention drawn to issues around Asia and the fact that India and China are at some level both partners, but also in some cases seem to be rivals. And they offer distinct models that potentially compete for influence. So that was one political challenge. Another political challenge was that heavy focus on the BRICS that I mentioned more generally, that create some obstacles for Southern partners to learn. There was also a political challenge in that the initial enthusiasm for data gathering can quickly wane away. And so the need to keep sustaining momentum for data collection exercises on an annual basis, or even every 2 to 5 years, it still requires a political commitment that can be hard to sustain. On the methodological side, there were some concerns about how you overcome challenges of comparing countries of different sizes and also with different historical normative environments. And I think the way we were getting answers to that challenge was that we do have global data sets that exist. We are capable of scaling, and we are capable of triangulating whatever data would be accumulated through a survey with other types of data, interpretive data, qualitative case studies, and that could potentially paint richer pictures. There was also some concerns methodologically about the lack of a clear definition around what South-South cooperation means, as again alluded to by the previous panelists. And at some level, there was an acceptance, though, that respondents can refer to their own implicit definition, particularly on the subjective side, but that by creating a database that would collect systematic, measurable data, you might in some sense get overcome some of the challenges around the definitional plurality within South-South cooperation. And lastly, some logistical challenges involving how you establish a systematic sampling frame, how you obtain the contact details to actually ensure an adequate response rate for such an online elite survey. And I think that the low response rate for this study potentially suggests some of those challenges are quite significant. Obtaining authorization to participate in a global survey, particularly if the results are somewhat uncomfortable, may also be a challenge. Cost can also be a challenge, and that will partly depend on the sample size, whether this is a one-off or a multi-annual exercise, to what extent it needs to be translated, and the type of software you use, whether it needs to be made more bespoke for this survey in particular. And logistically, and the most important logistical challenge, I think, was we need a clear organizational home for such an exercise with legitimacy and a network to reach critical stakeholders. And I think there was broadly a convergence of views that potentially the UN Office of South-South Cooperation could provide such a home because of its remit, its credibility, and its ability to disseminate amongst its networks. Last slide, Raphael, please. And so where do we go from here? And I think, I've outlined a few ideas in the paper and on the screen, but I think the first thing is we have to figure out is there a commitment to such an idea? And that means a political commitment, a financial commitment, and an organizational commitment to get such an exercise off the ground. We then would take us into the survey planning phase, some of the key elements of how one would launch such a survey, where, the length and frequency, and then really into the question of what kind of institutional variables might we be interested in. And I propose several options in the paper, which I'm not going to elaborate on here, and then a reviewing and pre-testing exercise of that questionnaire. And then really thinking about what complementary data we can use to draw into such a survey, because there is a certain amount of data outside in some of the existing reporting mechanisms that already exist. So we might need to scrape those and think about how we might triangulate across those data sources. And then finally, draw that into some form analysis with a view to hopefully informing the next generation of South-South cooperation providers. So I hope I've answered the bulk of your questions, Grace, but I'm happy to be probed later on. And thanks again for the opportunity to participate in this study. Thank you.
Thank you very much for this important study, which has been trying to address a question that we have in our mind all through these years. The feasibility, the challenges. Okay, my video. Okay, yeah. So the feasibilities and the challenges, and this is some very meaningful research to let us know what is the reality. We need to measure that tempo from year to year. I think we actually started with some selected studies 3 or 4 years ago, and then we had this dialogue before BAPA, and now we have BAPA, and we have post-BAPA, the 20th high-level committee. This question has always been there, but not yet fully answered, of course. So through your research, we also learned that if we reflect on Article 25, it is about collecting data at national level. And your research has told us that in reality, more active, you can find data from submitted by regional organizations or international organizations, but not necessarily at national level. So yes, I also heard at the end the recommendation that we need to, of course, consult our constituencies and really consider that. But at the same time, we can also update on some progress that we have made. For example, in terms of data collection, but again, more from the international organization's perspective. In the context of United Nations system-wide strategy for South-South cooperation, we do have a monitoring framework, and we do have a set of indicators that will be collected through the whole UN system on UN's support to South-South cooperation, which is different from what we're talking about, the data collection and gathering at the national level. However, this is one step forward to actually, because all the data are coming from the field, the countries, right? So that unintentionally also trigger more dialogue on the necessity and on the importance of such an exercise. However, I think this really needs a lot of dialogue based on your research funding and a few others, so that we can see what are the next steps, the concrete actions that we can, support the countries upon their request, of course. Yeah, so thank you very much. Now we comes to the dialogue. I think those research are quite, thought-provoking in a way that it dives into the evidence, and it requires a lot of thinking. We only received, I think, one question. If I'm wrong, Shams can remind me, please. That question is, did you find any difference about the knowledge sharing approach among the countries? This is particularly for, Lara and Professor Sachin. He has to step up for another commitment. And I think it's also relevant to Ninema for, during your research. So that is one question. Let me see. Do we have anything? Yes, okay. So this is the question. And I would also like to just open it up a little bit for you to add to this section, what you hear from the others, right? So Sachin's presentation, Lara and Ninema, feel free to add in your reflections to the others' presentation as well. So maybe we can start from Lara.
Yes, thank you. Yes, there are differences in knowledge sharing, but it's also very much on a project-based level. So I think the principle of horizontality and mutual learning, they are normative principles. Everybody's chasing them. It's hard to have evidence on mutual learning and on horizontality. I think the three countries have improved their, instruments and practices so that the knowledge sharing and the technical cooperation is more horizontal, is more on a mutual benefits based. But I would also like to address our colleagues' research from ODI. I think it was really interesting. And I also think that this challenge of sharing data on South-South cooperation for national governments, they are very sensitive about it because it's politically charged, because it's hard to compare, especially if you talk about the usual ODA standards and volumes. The volumes are very diverse, so people are afraid that they are going to show too little, or mine is to, and so if it's well represented, South-South cooperation, so it's connected, the idea of sharing knowledge and data, it's also connected to how the countries themselves look at it and measure it. And the issue of measurement, as we know, it's a very... Filho, momento ocupado, amor. Só minutinho, coração, sorry. The issue of measurement is key, it's unresolved, and it has to do with the kind of opportunity cost of every dollar that is spent by southern countries. It's more missed within boundaries, right? So it's it should be, I don't know, it should count more if we're going to compare, you know? So there's this sensibilities about South-South cooperation that I think the key word for improving this environment of knowledge sharing, data sharing is trust, building trust. Because if countries feel that they are in a place that they can share information, that they're not going to be unfairly compared, and that it's, you know, understanding of their circumstances and specificities, I think we can go a long way.
Thank you very much, Lara. And Nilima?
Thanks, Grace. And I wanted to respond to this question and the comments that Laura made, because they are critical. I couldn't agree more with some of the sensitivities around financial data. And what's interesting is you see that in the North now. You see attempts to fudge some of the standards around ODA reporting, to be able to report more and to double count, to change the way they count private sector instruments. So that risk is real, and it's existed even in the North. And I think that's why this survey is actually not about really the numbers as such. It's about the institutional structures, right? How many institutions? And I think to start somewhere, it would be less politically charged to start with the way the cooperation is organized, the institutional diversity that exists in the South, without necessarily sort of focusing on the numbers, because that will require a lot of dialogue, I think, to get some consensus across the South. So, and I think that still sits within the commitment in BAPA to collect data and to think about effectiveness on the institutional side in particular. So I think there is a potential sweet spot there in terms of this kind of this space on institutional capacity and data collection that we could start somewhere. On terms of the domestic costs of South-South cooperation that you alluded to, this potential view of a trade-off between domestic spending and international overseas spending, that's very real. And it's very real in the North in the current particular moment as well. But I think I agree with you that there is a need to build trust with domestic constituencies and build conversations domestically as well as internationally. And one way to do that is by providing data around what cooperation is doing and the results it is achieving. And that is by no means a perfect science. Northern cooperation providers have not achieved the right balance there either, but I think there's an opportunity for lesson drawing across the North and South on that particular issue. But I also like to think that by opening up a little bit of the black box on issues around institutional capacity in particular, we might go some way to building domestic public constituencies for South-South cooperation in the South itself. Thanks.
Yeah, thank you very much. Thank you to both of you for responding to that. And also I see Helge from NORAD has shared a comment in the chat box. The pandemic has made it more difficult to share knowledge through South-South personnel, mutual visits and exchanges. And there are some aspects of personal visits which is difficult to achieve virtually, such as trust building. Yeah, this is a very important, reminder as well. And then we need to think about how do we actually, through South-South cooperation, building trust. People-to-people exchange is definitely a great way of building trust. Another way I could think about is based on our experience of sharing knowledge these days. In the past, not these days, during the past few years, right? We have been compiling good practices on South-South cooperation for SDGs and using this SDG goals to be the guiding, principle for the good practices for South-South cooperation. And also in that simple template, very broadly mention those commonly accepted criteria, such as horizontality, replicability and sustainability, partnership. So those are the elements that easily glue people together. and help us to address the issue of mistakenly politicized development cooperation. So that is also a way to build, trust. The way that we share knowledge, I think, sometimes can contribute to the trust building as well. Thank you very much for all these comments. So Shams has a question. Do we need a uniform South-South? It's not Shams, right? It's a question from the audience, and Shams is sharing about, do we need a uniformed South-South measuring and evaluation framework, or it is better to keep it as diversified as it is, especially when taking the heterogeneity of South-South countries and South-South cooperation as a concept and the modality into cooperation. And this question is from Faiza Effendi. From Latin America, we learned that there's no cookie cutter approach to have South-South work. What might be the one low-hanging fruit to deliver results through South-South cooperation? Given all the challenges with data collection, how do we get the maximum out of what we have and have access to, realistically speaking? Albert Einstein has once said, not everything that can be counted counts, and not everything that counts can be counted. So we see like we have now very active thoughts and ideas from the participants, and that is very good. And we still have 7 minutes to go, and I will leave time, save time for Yuko to do a conclusion, unless any of you have immediate reaction to those comments. Yes, please, Nilima.
So I just want to comment on one of the observations that were made, which is there are challenges with data collection. And the Albert Einstein quote, I completely subscribe to the ethos and the thinking behind that. But I think what our literature review suggests is that in terms of the counting aspect, there isn't very much currently that is being counted across South-South cooperation. So if anything, we've skewed the other way, more towards, the philosophy of Albert Einstein's, that quotation in particular. So I guess what I'm suggesting is there's an opportunity for both forms of data collection, and that we need both, but we are very much skewed in the more anecdotal narrative analysis, or a group of 2 to 5 case studies, and that perhaps there's an opportunity to build something here, to do exactly what Laura suggested, to build domestic constituencies for South-South cooperation, which I think is imperative for its overall longevity. Thanks.
Thank you, Linima. And also we see a comment from South Center, Ms. Yuefen Li. Thank you very much. This is basically the question that we had discussed during our review process with you, Lima, about this low response rate of 11%. It, does raise the question of validity of the survey results. But I think let me, address that. We indeed had the discussion, but we still think it's worth sharing, even the 11%, the low response rate itself as a finding. It is a methodology observation, but it's also a finding that it gives that question even louder, like is the reluctance or it's the lacking of enthusiasm from the national partners to actually having such a exercise. So this is also, we're not trying to answer that question to say, yes, it's feasible, we should do it, or, as Linima also presenting, there seems to be an opportunity to further explore. So Linima, you wanted to add something here? Yes, I see.
Yeah, just a quick one. So that response rate of 11%, I mean, that was me. There was no institutional support for this online questionnaire. Essentially, it was me building a network, a contact database based on networks that I was in. So it's non-random, it's non-representative sample. We had in our database about 60 policymakers. We were very much targeting the policymakers in Southern cooperation agencies as our sample. And I think that that response rate is reflective of the limitations of me running this. And that's why an organizational home, political support, I think those are really critical. And as Grace said, this is just a feasibility study. This was a small online questionnaire to gauge policymakers' views on the feasibility, the benefits and the challenges. So it wasn't actually I wasn't running the survey itself trying to gather the data. I was trying to solicit opinions and views through an online questionnaire targeting that sample. But it clearly needs political commitment and an institutional home somewhere to really improve on that. Thanks.
Yeah, thank you very much. I think, this the beauty of this kind of webinar is that we raise many questions that we could further explore with interested parties, and also shared some evidence that we could learn from. And thank you very much. But now let me have the pleasure to invite Ms. Yuko Suzuki, the Global Policy Advisor on Effective Development Cooperation, to do the summary, the concluding remarks. And Yuko, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Grace. Representative of the South-South Global Thinkers community, friends and colleagues, ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much for your insightful presentation. I think it has been really an interesting discussion that we initiated today. On behalf of UNDP, it's been an honor to co-host today's webinar with the UN Office of South-South Cooperation, and then also jointly launched 5 papers by the members of the Global South-South Thinkers Network, 3 of which we were able to discuss today. I wouldn't necessarily sort of conclude and summarize very, very rich discussions, but I think just to point out the papers most of all the papers actually touches on the importance of institutional capacity strengthening in the Global South and the critical role of institutionalization and the impact assessment of South-South and Triangle cooperations. And I think our discussion also pointed out the usefulness for countries to consider a national institutional framework or architecture for South-South cooperations suitable for their own context and modalities. And then also within that context, the role of regional institutions for really countries to become much more effective players and the partners in the South-South Triangle cooperation, but also really achieving the global agenda, the 2030 agenda. We also heard about an idea of a global survey on the institutional architecture for South-South and Triangle cooperations to help countries strengthen their national institutional frameworks through more or less from a knowledge sharing, information sharing, but also learning. The discussion also reaffirmed that the pluralities actually is one of the fundamental strengths of the South-South cooperation, and to this end, the usefulness of consolidating analysis from a number of country case studies, hopefully that will be coming in the next year or so, to further enrich the efforts for make greater impact through South-South and Triangle cooperation in the achievement of the SDGs. We believe, together with the UN Office of South-South Cooperation, that this event has shown that the investment in independent researchers is critical to the growing body of knowledge evidence on the issues pertinent to South-South and Triangle cooperation. And in addition, we have also reminded the importance of connecting the growing body of knowledge and evidence with the policies and practice of the South-South and Triangle cooperation. Events like this, we believe, will be a good opportunity to bring think tank communities, governments, partners, international organizations, and others to strengthen the collaboration and advance thought leadership in the South-South and Triangle cooperation. So in this regard, I want to thank the UN Office of South-South Cooperation, Grace and her team, for being a firm supporter and a co-host of the South-South Global Thinkers Initiatives. And once again, express our joint appreciation to all of you for joining our discussions today. UNDP and UN Office of South-South Cooperation will continue working together in strengthening our support to these initiatives, the Global South-South Thinker Network initiatives, and I'm looking forward to your continued engagement in contributing to the growing body of knowledge and evidence on the South-South and Triangle cooperation. So thank you very much, and I wish you all a good day, afternoon, and evening.
So thank you, colleagues. And we see 3 more common questions coming up in the chat box. And that means it's a successful event that we could follow up with more discussions on those. And you even see UNDP Mexico commit for the support as institutional support for data collection. So thank you, colleagues. And let's have more such discussions in the future. Thank you, bye. And we see colleagues from Asia, from China staying late. Thank you. Okay, bye-bye. Take care, Laura. Hope you recover soon. Bye.